because we are a city that is full of incredible and special people.
Welcome, everyone. We're here for the May edition of Block by Block with Mayor Tim Keller. Mayor, thanks for joining us again. I wanted to kind of get a check on where you're at now that you've been in office for 6 months. Let's start with the good, the positive. What are some of the highlights that you feel like, have been accomplished, at least in your first 6 months? And I'm sure it's a little bit like drinking from the fire hose because you're still getting used to this job.
Sure. Well, I think we've taken some significant steps. We've got a long ways to go. But number one, we were able to restructure our police department, and we were able to do that in a way that pushed resources down to the front line. And we submitted our first budget, which is, sounds a little bit policy wonkish, but is a huge deal because a budget's a reflection of our priorities. And 80% of the new money in that budget is going to go to law enforcement and behavioral health, addiction treatment, homelessness. And so these are actually things we're sort of setting the stage to try and move the needle on some of the core issues in our city. And in some small ways, we've had some progress too. We're now at the top of cool lists for millennials and also travel destinations. And so Albuquerque is sort of cool again. And that's a good thing. And also, we've been able to bring in about 300 new jobs from recruiting from out-of-state companies. And so that always helps too. And so we've done some other things along the way. We created our first Office of Equity and Inclusion, which is really helping towards our goal of an innovative and inclusive city. And we're also working on some interesting IT apps so that we're going to be able to do permitting and event planning all from your cell phone, which is one of the biggest things. City performers or anyone who's doing any event in town, that's been the number one thing folks want the city to improve on. And so we're going to put it all in the palm of your hand.
Well, you've been busy. And I noticed that you've also made a number of rounds at different civic organizations and talking to neighborhood groups. And one of the things that you said recently in one of the talks that you gave in your remarks, you said that, we have to take a pretty thorough reality check at some of the challenges we face in Albuquerque. Let's just take a listen to one of those sound bites that you said.
Unfortunately, we have to admit and we have to acknowledge we are a city that is stricken by addiction, that is dealing with real crime problems that are worse than they've been in any recent years that most folks can remember. And we're in the grips of a struggle with homelessness. And we are a city, I think, treading water just to keep up.
Mayor, you also went on to say that you wanted to kind of guide people, the residents, on a sort of purpose-driven path. And kind of focus in on some of the things that we know that make Albuquerque great. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's something that our city's gone through phases in, where we go through difficult times, whether it's the economy or crime, and we get a little down on ourselves in terms of our own strengths. And I think we sometimes lose sight of our core identity. And what that really means is, we are a strong and special place. When you think of our natural beauty combined with our cultural heritage and the economy that we do have and the opportunities that we do have, folks have to realize that we're very resilient. We've been through tough times before, but we have to come together and really realize that we don't have to be exactly like Denver. We don't have to be Portland. Yeah, we want to learn from other cities, but we want to be the best Albuquerque we can be. And we are so unique, we should really hang on to that and cherish that, because if we can correct some of these major issues like crime, some of the challenges in our school system, our city sells itself because of all of that natural beauty and that cultural heritage. So I really believe, if we can get some of the basics down, we're going to be in a great place.
Absolutely. One of the analogies you used, and it's, we're always on to the next thing and the next thing. And let's face it, we're kind of in an age where we absorb information so quickly that we forget where we've been. And I liked how you put it. You said, we need to remember Albuquerque's story. And you used a great example of how when you were younger, Nob Hill wasn't that great a place to go. Yet
True.
Look at it today,
Yeah, I remember I've always liked heavy metal music, and when I was really young, I I used to go to there were tape stores, cassette tapes. That's how old it was.
Right, I remember those.
Not quite eight track. I was too young for that. But so for cassettes and going to record stores, there were a lot down in Nob Hill, and there were some also in the International District. And I remember how dangerous it was down there early on, and also just in general. People would tell you like not to go down to Nob Hill because it was run down. I mean, now, it's just you can't even remember that. But and then it's a different story. But just to the point of our resilience, what we go through, the International District, which I used to represent, such an important area of our city, been through real tough times in the 90s, and yes, they have challenges now, but those of us who were here in the 90s, it is still nothing like it was then. And that community came together. They took back their community. And even if we're dealing with crime issues now, it is nothing like it was back then. So I think it's important to remember, like, we've been through some tough times, and some of our communities have been through some tough times. And I think we've shown a remarkable ability to come together and right the ship. But we've got to do that again right now.
Absolutely. I think, you're right about looking back and how the transformation in the International District now, there are so many cool events, public events that people attend and go to. Cyclovia, all the things that happen there now, it's a testament to how, like you said, the ownership that residents kind of set the pace in the tone if they want things to change, that real change can happen. You also, I've heard you issue like a warning of sorts about being careful not to pin all our hopes on that silver bullet of economic vitality and healing, whether it's a Tesla plant or Amazon, but that to really kind of look inward at the things that we already do well. And I like exactly what you said, so I'm going to point again to one of those sound bites.
Some of those things are worth trying, and if we get them, that's awesome. That is awesome. But we cannot rely on them any longer. What I'm proposing and what my administration is about is something much different. It's about focus. It's about narrow focus on the things we have to get done.
And Mayor, you also talked about specifically focusing on the competitive advantage and how impact plays a special role in what we need to do going forward.
Yeah, I think sometimes we as a city get this attitude that if there's just one thing we could do different,
right,
all of a sudden everything would be fixed. And you mentioned a lot of examples of that, and I have often talked about that even back on the campaign trail. And what we're proposing is something different. Politicians tend to come out and say, hey, this one idea is going to change our city, or we need to make a big bet on something. But actually, we see over the past, I think our history, we kind of try a lot of those, and we all get ginned up about it. And sometimes they pay off, sometimes they don't. But we really, I think, would get a lot further by just essentially focusing on what's going to actually move the needle. So instead of saying it's one particular idea, it's actually just like a belief in the notion of return on investment. It's a very bland idea. But the idea is, look, a particular project, is it going to create jobs, base jobs? Is it a growing industry? Is this an area where Albuquerque can actually be a national leader? So instead of just investing in any industry or generic industries like healthcare, it's like, well, what slice of that can we be the best at? That's competitive advantage. And where can we actually retain that status so that we're not just growing companies that leave? How can we actually keep folks here? So trying to invest our money where we get the highest return or the highest impact, and invest our policy efforts and even our time and energy. That's a very different way of looking at things. So instead of holding up like a shiny object that we all need to focus on, it's saying, how do we actually create a shiny object?
Sure. And as far as crime, I know, there's a number of challenges we face with crime, although the statistics, as you have mentioned, are down in a number of areas as it relates to crime. And you spoke about the restructuring and how that's had an impact. But you also, I guess in that same vein, you talked about attacking crime from all sides, not just that one thing that's going to make a difference, but that how we look at it in sort of a multi-pronged approach. And I really liked one of the things you had said to a group recently.
Now, when it comes to crime, I believe in attacking it from all sides. And we started by doing that by restructuring APD. It was the largest restructuring in our department's history. We've pushed resources towards the front line, and we are recommitted to DOJ compliance.
Mayor, you said that we can't really be a prosperous city if we don't get a handle on crime, and you specifically mentioned that the style of community policing can really help in that regard, and really taking a hard look at going after auto theft and things like that.
Yeah, this is the ideas that we've talked about even today and that I've been mentioning. This is kind of a similar story where in terms of law enforcement, over the last few years, we've been grasping at these ideas like data is going to solve all our problems, or if we only have this new policing technique or this new equipment, that it's going to solve our crime problem. And I think actually it's time we get back to some of the basics. We're pulling people over now if you're speeding. We are going after stolen cars. The theory was that we have to focus on violent crime, but what we've learned is that the stolen car is used to do all of that violent crime. It's either a currency that is being traded for drugs or to pay off debts, or it's literally a getaway vehicle, but in many times it's actually sort of joyriding for gang initiation. I mean, there's a number of things, but they all come down to cars. So if you're not enforcing auto theft, you're not getting it like that common point between all sorts of other crime. And so it's actually the easiest way to fight violent crime is to go after auto theft. It's very counterintuitive, but it's something we actually learned from NYPD when they came out here. And so that's something that we're focused on. But most importantly, the overarching philosophy is to really go block by block, beat by beat, and say, look, we are going to have a set of officers, and they're in charge of a particular area. They're going to work with the neighborhoods, they're going to work with the businesses, and they're going to stay there over time so that they can get to know the actual situation there and then predict and prevent crime from happening. So it's an old-fashioned way of policing, but I think this is where we're at as a city. We need that again. And I think what we've shown is a lot of the kind of tricks or like quick win ideas, they just haven't worked. They were worth trying, but they just haven't done the job. Sure. And so now we got to do it the old-fashioned way.
Which probably isn't a bad thing to go back to. It seemed to work in the old days. Why not bring some of those core things forward and see if they can work again?
Well, it's true. And by old days, we're talking about like 2000 to 2005, right. So it was just this notion of connecting people to a specific community and law enforcement and bringing them together to work on issues. That's something that even when I started in the state Senate, we had made a lot of progress on, and crime was at a relatively low point, all the way up until I think around 2010. But then to kind of save money and optimize resources and utilize technology, we really went away from that. And I think that's been one of our biggest problems.
And you also mentioned that this budget that you're submitting is possibly going to help with that, especially the thin police force that we have now. But the budget can help in some way. How so?
I think the reality is, as you've mentioned, we were in for a long summer in a sense that we know that crime is where it's at. Homelessness is a big problem, but those are going to take resources. And I think the good news is we acknowledge that. That's why we built in literally about $30 million for public safety for all aspects of it into the budget. And so far, council has been very supportive. But it takes time to get that money in. So the budget comes out, and we collect it, and then we have to do recruiting, and then we have to do training. So I'm hoping somewhere around the fall, we are literally sort of bringing in the reinforcements that our city's been needing in all sorts of areas. But until then, we're just going to have to come together and do more with less for a little bit. But I hope that there is help on the way.
Absolutely. Now, you said that you think over the next 4 years we can get to 400 officers. And you also stressed within that statement that unlike other cities that have kind of a one-stop shop for behavioral health issues, that we also need to kind of focus on that as well, because there are crossovers within crime and behavioral health.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this has been one of the challenges, is that our city is just right now suffering from a terrible addiction problem. And you get addiction, sort of poverty, addiction, crime, and that cycle is reinforcing. And to me, this is the biggest driver behind the crime rates that we see, is actually from addiction, behavioral health issues. So we're hoping over the summer, we're going to check out a few other cities. Tucson has a great program. San Antonio has a great program. Almost every city has some sort of one-stop shop, as you mentioned. We do not right now. And so it's something we need to, at a minimum, make a firm decision on. But, maybe for 2 years, instead of working on a lot of amenities, fields on the west side or whatever things that are nice and we enjoy, we just need to pause for a minute and invest in that core thing that is really bringing us down. And it might be a one-stop behavioral health treatment center.
That would be nice to have something like that, because there are so many crossovers, and there's so many, as you said, homelessness, and within those different sects, you see that those things are still happening, and that cycle is going to continue unless we do something to sort of stem the tide and address the real issue rather than the symptom that we're often seeing in our community.
We have so many nonprofits that help, and they do everything they can to try and deal with either homelessness or getting supportive housing. There's a whole spectrum of services. But what we've never done as a city is said, like, look, this is such an issue. We have to step up and own this as a city. So let's get all of the folks together who work on this. Let's figure out a way to do this under one roof and provide the services that we need in a seamless way. I think we've gotten this far basically with the amazing work of a bunch of nonprofits and well-intentioned folks. But I'm worried that it's naive to think that that is going to be the solution going forward, because the problem is that big.
Right. And you mentioned about setting ourselves up as the leader and the resource that other people and other cities can look to, and in some of the things that we really do well. And all of these areas, whether it's crime or behavioral health, all of them sort of go hand in hand, because to have a good economy, that's one of the things that people look at in our city. And so I think that, one of the things that you mentioned was placemaking. And how do we make step development happen here in the city? You had talked about that as an economic development tool, and I really liked what you had to say.
We are going to throw every economic development tool into those projects to make sure they get done. We are going to load up tax increment districts, IRBs, LEDA funding, every single thing we can do to make sure that hopefully 4 years or however long ago, we are not talking about that same parking lot next to Civic Plaza that's been empty forever. Or we're not talking about the rail yards, which has been empty forever. We have to make those places in that place-making sense in Albuquerque, and then we have to connect them to the other great places that we have.
So explain exactly what that means, and what's the timeline that you would attach to that?
So, historically we've looked at projects, and these are public projects. So, private businesses on private land can do, whatever they need to do. This is about where we actually spend our taxpayer money. And so the idea is basically that we need to look at investments in our city that have incremental benefit for the neighborhoods around them or for the community as a whole. So rather than just saying, okay, we're going to transform refurbish a hotel on Central that was dilapidated. That's good in and of itself, but we can do better than that. We can actually create a gathering place or a community place that people actually want to go to on the evenings and weekends, and that'll catalyze the development around it. And so a good example of this are, the rail yards is something we've pointed to in the last decade in our city, and we haven't really been able to do anything with it. And I think this is such a good example where it will energize all of downtown if we can actually create some incredible space in the rail yards, mixed use, community space, creative space for artists. That could actually be a hallmark of our city statewide, that people come to visit, like it is in a lot of other states that have sort of refurbished markets and so forth downtown. So I think if we focus on those types of projects that create a place, and the notion of a place is a place that is accessible and desired by all walks of life at all times of day and all days of the week. So you're not just building something that's being used once a month. And that's where we've got to get. That'll revitalize downtown. So we can do that in other areas. We're doing some of that at Central and Unser, in fact, even on the west side. But that's how we actually build, I think, a modern world-class city instead of just doing development.
Mm-hmm. And it would be really neat to see the rail yards be the catalyst for some of that. Because you go to other cities, and a lot of times their development is occurring along some of those traditional areas like the rail yards and such, and tons of people go down there and enjoy that. There's no reason. We have great weather. To have a facility like that be something that we were known for. And lastly, you have said that one of the things we really need to do is step up for our kids in this city, and gone are the days of kind of finger pointing at who's really responsible for that.
hmm You know, it's funny. I sound like I have lived here 80 years, I think, when I talk about this. But I think in terms of public service dog years equivalent, it
Right.
feels like 80.
Sure.
So, you know, when I first got in the state legislature, I had all these bills I was running on education. I was on the education committee, and governors were doing everything. Everyone was always talking about education, and it just hasn't made that much of a difference, unfortunately. And then at the local level, and even as auditor, I was like, accountability, accountability. We got to hold EPS accountable. But you know, I mean, we can do that, and we're saying things need to change, and you know, the results are what they are, which is more of the same.
Right.
So I'm taking a different approach as mayor. Mayor has, like, in literal sense, nothing to do with our schools. So that's why I'm not going to tell them how to teach our kids. I'm not going to tell them how to run their schools. I'm going to try and find a way to help our kids. And a mayor can do that after school and over the summer. Those are the two areas where I can actually be helpful. And it's not about pointing fingers or trying to force someone else to do something differently. It's about proactively stepping up and helping and saying, you know what, you've got all those issues and you should deal with them. But instead of me sitting here talking about your problems, I'm going to be part of the solution. And that's why our city is committed to doubling the number of activities for after-school programs and summer programs for our kids. It keeps them out of trouble, keeps them enriched and engaged. This is the one area where nationally we all agree our kids lose traction compared to the rest of the world because they're off during the summer and because the school day doesn't correlate with the work day. So if I can fill in those gaps as mayor, I think we can actually make a difference.
That'd be kind of cool too. So basically, in a nutshell, getting crime under control, driving real impact when it comes to the economy and placemaking, stepping up for the kids, those three things are kind of the core to seeing to that roadmap that you talked about moving forward, and you kind of neatly summarized that recently. So that said, one of the things that I think you're trying to stress is that really the leadership has to come from within the community. As you talked about earlier with transformations of neighborhoods and things that we're doing differently, the citizens have to kind of lead the charge and be inspired to do that.
Yeah, you know, we're all in this together. And I think what we're trying to articulate is this notion that we're one Albuquerque. And the basis around that idea is basically saying that, you know, there's our taking responsibility for our challenges is not only critical, it's the only way we're going to deal with a lot of this, but we can find ways to do it on our own. And our administration is going to be articulating ways to do that, whether it's helping out on different projects, recruiting police officers, or helping renovate the rail yards in many ways. We might have sort of a citywide cleanup effort. But the idea is that we got to take ownership of our future. And so my job is to lead the way for the city as mayor. But I think it's everyone's job to come together and say, look, let's focus on a couple of these priorities. I love a whole lot of other things like sustainable energy, and you know, I've got a huge list of fun projects to do. But I don't want to lose sight of these three key areas, and I think the public should help with that and essentially say that, look, you know what, maybe now isn't the time for, for example, you know, a new project way out in the suburbs because we're not growing. We got to take care of our core. Now is the time to reinvest in downtown. Or instead of arguing over, well, you know, my neighborhood needs this and that neighborhood needs this, we all agree we've got to clean up our public parks in general. So let's just actually clean up and make the best out of the parks that we have. And we have different ways to do that. So it's just this idea of kind of putting the greater good of the city up there so that we remember that not just exactly what's happening on our corner. And so that kind of approach, I believe, extends across to the county and the city working together to APD working with the DA's office, the idea that we're all in this together. It doesn't matter whether we're in Los Ranchos or whether we're in high desert. We really are one Albuquerque, whether we like it or not. And so we've got to acknowledge that and support these efforts.
Well, you talked about fun projects, and I do know that that's something we're going to talk about in June's edition of Block by Block. So thank you for your time today to talk about that, and we look forward to visiting the fun projects of summer for the city of Albuquerque come June.
We've got a lot of good stuff planned, and we'll tell you about it next time.
Great.
Because we are a city that is full of incredible and special people.